Welcome everyone to TheJournal.ie and the European Parliament in Ireland's webinar on misinformation and fact-checking in Ireland, the UK and Europe over the last 3 to 4 months. We at TheJournal.ie began fact-checking back in 2016, and I mean fact-checking with the capital F sense of the word. That was before Trump, before Brexit, so we were obviously tapping into something that we knew was happening. It was actually just ahead of our own general election in Ireland in 2016. So over the next 4 years, we haven't really had our Trump or Brexit or migration crisis moment in the same way the UK, the US and mainland Europe have seen, but then Covid-19 happened. So we felt like now was the perfect time, as did the European Parliament, just to take stock about what has been happening in the fact-checking world, in the misinformation world and the disinformation world. And to start that, we wanted to see what our participants had seen over the last few months. So we just put those quick polls together. We'll bring you the results of them in a few minutes. And I just think that the answers in Ireland would have been very different if we asked about misinformation in the last, maybe if we'd even asked this time 6 months ago, the answers would have been different. So between ourselves and the European Parliament, we've put this wonderful panel together to get into this discussion. You've probably been able to have a nose around their homes. I came to the Journal's offices today. I pulled rank, and Nikki, our producer, has a lovely light on me, so makeup and a light is something new for the last 4 months. And I'm joined by our deputy editor, Christine Bohan, who has been the lead on our fact-checking project, which ramped up spectacularly, obviously, with COVID-19. She is also the hero behind our WhatsApp phone, which I'm sure she'll talk a lot more about in the next hour and a half. Nicola Aitken joins us from FullFact. She joined the UK fact-checking organisation in March of this year, just in time for all of this madness. So she'll bring us her experience of COVID-19 from the UK. She leads FullFact policy work on online harms and media literacy. And until March 2020, she was head of countering disinformation in the UK's civil service. So has two different experiences to bring us today. Enerud is a journalist and he works for the Europe External Action Service. His team at the EU East Stratcom Task Force looked to detect, document and debunk disinformation coming from pro-Kremlin sources. And Billy Kelleher, MEP for the South constituency since 2019. And I've promised I won't bring up any junior ministry chat. I did that in the green room with him, but it might come up in a Q&A later, Billy, so be prepared. He's part of the Renew Europe group, which has published a paper on disinformation and EU actions. And he's also written for TheJournal.ie before on disinformation in Europe. So a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. If you have a question, if you stick it into the Q&A option at the bottom of Zoom, we'll be answering some of them live in text, and other of them, the rest of them, we'll go to at the end of the discussion. And if you just want to say, if you have a direct panelist you want to ask, or if it's something for everybody, just let us know. And if you give your name and the organization you're asking from as well, that would be great. And we also have a hashtag, so please use hashtag FactCheckingCovid if you're tweeting about our event today. So I think that's pretty much everything. One of the things I wanted to kick off with, and I'll just run through each of the panelists' answer on this, but Nicola, I'm going to start with you, because when we say misinformation, it often means different things to different people. So when you hear misinformation, what do you take it as to mean, and what does your organization take it as to mean?
Yeah, it's absolutely a really important question. For us, misinformation is information which is being inadvertently spread. So it's being spread without the intention to cause harm. People might not realize that it's false information or it's misleading. And I think that's the majority of what we've seen in the coronavirus pandemic. So it's your family members who are genuinely trying to pass on information that they think will help, but unfortunately, ultimately is false or misleading.
Per, your experience in what you work in is slightly different. So just so people are aware, when people are talking on the panel, when you hear misinformation, what is your interpretation of it?
Well, I think you're perfectly right. When misinformation is about the intent, it's a lack of intent for spreading the line. In the case of disinformation, we are working on a definition that is based on it should be verifiably false, and it should be intended to harm. And we can see this is orchestrated from the Kremlin. It's very well funded, very well organized, and it's intended to sow distrust in institutions and in national health system, etc.
And for yourself, Billy, when you went over to Parliament in July. This is an area that has really interested you. What kind of misinformation have you been interested in tackling?
Well, I mean, it's amazing. We're slightly cocooned in Ireland, even though we're in the age of the internet. But I mean, when you go to Europe and you see firsthand, there's huge concerns, particularly as you go further east in the European Union, about the sphere of influence that Russia is having in disinformation and misinformation, and just in terms of the meddling in the affairs of other countries through social media, through the internet. And that is an issue of real concern. So, for example, in COVID, quite recently, you would have seen a huge amount of disinformation around Europe not helping Italy or not helping Spain, and that how the Russians and how the Chinese came to help the Italians, and yet the Europeans didn't. And of course, if you actually drill through the statistics and the facts, that is disinformation at the highest level. But these things were being sown by people who are anti-European, by entities who are anti-European, and just trying to undermine the harmony in Europe. So that would be one key area that just was very evident throughout the early stages of the COVID-19 crisis.
And Christine, for yourself, from an Irish perspective, what is misinformation in Ireland?
It tallies a lot with what Nicola was saying there about it's people who they think that they're trying to be helpful, they're trying to share information because they think that their family or friends might be able to use it, or because someone else isn't telling them. And I think Ireland's always been quite different to other countries because we've had such low levels of it. You know, we don't have dedicated outlets that spread misinformation. When there is false news, it rarely goes viral. We found that when we talk to fact checkers in other countries, their experience is just so different. We've been very lucky that we don't see disinformation in Ireland, you know, where we see people deliberately trying to sow some chaos. So I think Ireland, really, we've never seen viral hoaxes, or the kind of stories that you think of when you hear false news, like say Pope Francis has endorsed Donald Trump, that kind of thing. But we also haven't seen recurrent themes emerging, which can act as a magnet for false stories. So say, if you think of how the UK has Brexit or the US has Trump, and in the rest of Europe, the big one has been migration. But Ireland has never really seen these big topics, which become, you know, like a nexus or a magnet for misinformation until COVID happened.
Do you know why that is, or do you have any theories as to why that is?
I don't know why, but I do have theories, and I think the main thing is that we've never had the set of circumstances that has let false news flourish in other countries. So Ireland's politics is less partisan. We know that other countries would have seen big divides emerge in politics after the big recession, and this allowed false news to embed and to grow as people felt more alienated. We also know our news organizations are more balanced than other countries in their news coverage, so we don't see partisan news organizations spreading misinformation, and this is mainstream ones or more niche ones, and it's hugely important and we can't take it for granted. But we don't have public figures who set out to spread misinformation, so politicians, but then also people who just traffic in spreading these false stories and often have been given platforms to do so. So it could be the President of the United States, it could be a Katie Hopkins type. We've been very lucky not to have that take on. We do have sites like The Liberal, which people may know. We do see some fascists, white supremacists on social media, but they're generally speaking to tiny audiences and they haven't broken through. They're speaking to their own very, very small bubbles. The one times where we have seen some kind of more general misinformation has been around kind of time-specific topics. So if you think around, like, say, the water charges protests, the abortion referendum, the Jobstown trial, they did attract some false stories, but these would have faded away once the event had faded from the news. They didn't stick around. So I think the big question for Ireland is going to be, do we bounce back to normal once we get through this pandemic, the way we did after other moments of misinformation, or has this just changed everything, and is it here for good now?
Because Per, you could probably talk about that European experience where it is there for good. What kind of phenomenons do European countries see, and is it country specific, or do you see kind of most of the bloc seeing the same kinds of misinformation and disinformation?
I think the operatives, those who work on spreading disinformation, are getting better and better at focusing to a certain audience. We can see, for instance, 5 years ago when our group was set up, I have to, by the way, say that we're mainly focusing on Kremlin, pro-Kremlin Russian disinformation. So other actors are there as well. But we see a better understanding on how to work with different audiences. So in order to be a good liar, you need to be a very good listener. So the production of disinformation is based on understanding grievances and discontent that is always already existent. I can take a very clear example connected to the COVID-19 case, and this is the 5G topic, which in the beginning of the pandemic never occurred in the pro-Kremlin, Russia-based disinformation efforts. After a few weeks, when the productions understood that this is an existent conspiracy, they started to add the 5G topic to their efforts to spread disinformation. So it's a very agile and well-organized organization.
Nicola, in your experience of disinformation in the UK, does it align more with what Christine is saying about what happens in Ireland, or more what Per is saying is what happens in Europe?
I think it's a mixture of the two. I mean, I think we do have to remember that false and misleading information is not new. As much of a cliche as that is, I will be the first person to say it, I'm afraid. You know, FullFact has been around for 10 years now, and we've been fact-checking for that long because there has been misleading information in the public debate for that long. Obviously, what's changed is the methods by which people are getting their information and sharing information. In terms of disinformation specifically, I mean, I think that Per is absolutely right that a lot of the hostile actors in this space are opportunistic, and they pick up on the events which you know, are already in public discourse. To go back to the example that you raised on 5G, FullFact actually published a report last June which said, we think that there's a lot of 5G misinformation out there, and we think this is going to become a problem at some point. Unfortunately, you know, that was proven true earlier this year with COVID. So a lot of these things are not new. A lot of the stories that we've seen are not new. And I think that we need to be a bit better at preempting what may come.
What could that preempting look like?
I think it's exactly like the example for 5G. So, you know, we, through the Facebook third-party fact-checking program, which FullFact is a part of, as is, you know, TheJournal and many others across Europe, through that we see a lot of stories that are being flagged as potentially false. And I think when you see the patterns in that, you see the posts that are maybe getting small engagement now, actually, you know, you can track that over time and see where it may be starting to grow. And I think early warning is one of the most important and most effective things that we can do in this space. If we're aware of it, then we can put out the right information, the correct information before it really takes hold.
Christine, just to focus on COVID for a few minutes, because as you said, it really became our moment for misinformation. Can you run us through what exactly happened in Ireland? What was the scale of it? What were the big false stories? And were there any early warning signs that Nicola is talking about there?
Yeah, I think the scale is interesting because it really felt like it just exploded, and almost overnight. Just to give an idea of the scale, like it's very hard to put exact numbers on it at all, but to give one idea, we set up a phone number so that people could send us on any dodgy messages that they were sent on WhatsApp, so that we could fact check them and debunk them. And we got over 800 messages in the first weekend in mid-March. And I think we had not expected that at all. We had no idea it was that big. I think that's when it became clear that all of these buttresses or things that we had in place to stop false news, like our balanced media and our lack of partisanship, it didn't really matter. You know, they helped to delay it, but they weren't a protection against it. There was this audience of people who wanted to share the misinformation. There were platforms that let them do it, and that was it. That was what was needed. So I think you can divide the COVID misinformation stories in Ireland into two waves. And the first wave is all based around anxiety. And I actually have an example in a slide here, if that can be shown on screen. This is just an example of one of the messages that we were sent. I think we got this sent like 80 times in one day, on one day in March. And this was just, I think, 3 days after Leo Varadkar's big speech. And it hit on some of the tropes seen in these messages. I'm not sure if it's showing up on screen there, is it?
He will be, our producer's just working on it. It'll be 2 seconds.
Great. Well, basically people, when you can't see it, it's a WhatsApp message and it's somebody saying, it's something like, oh yeah, if you can see it there, it's like saying, I got this from a Garda, it's going to be a full lockdown, you're going to be not going to be able to get into shops, you need to start stockpiling food. It was all these kind of scaremongery things. And this is just so typical of the kind of messages that were rooted in this wave of anxiety. A lot of these messages would have had they cite an authority figure, like this one mentions a Garda, other ones talk about Defence Forces figures. They'll say things like there's going to be a full lockdown on the streets, that people need to stock up on food and water, that the government wasn't telling people about cases in hospitals. And they were so common, they were shared by so many people on WhatsApp. I would imagine that most people here who are in Ireland would have seen at least one of them telling them that something was being kept from them. So that's the first wave. And if that one's based around anxiety, the second wave would be based more on distrust in institutions and authorities. So the first wave would have started in kind of February, peaked in around March. The second wave, it started in April and we're still in the middle of it. So I think it's very hard to say, are we in the peak? Are we past the peak? I don't know when the peak is, basically, because there's so much of it. And it's about distrust in governments and health authorities, billionaires, financial institutions. It's often conspiracy theories. So there's a whole Facebook group in Ireland at the moment that's been growing steadily. And it talks about how the pandemic is being used to stop people from, to turn Ireland into a cashless society. So it's the government trying to get everyone to use their cards instead. So you can be tracked by banks and by governments, and they'll always know where you are and how you're spending your money. And Ireland would never have seen this kind of misinformation before. We never saw these pages. We've seen ones about like Bill Gates being hauled up before the International Criminal Court. And again, these would have been tiny, like if they were shared in Ireland at all before coronavirus, it would have been tiny, like such a small audience. And now it's just racking up more, like they're racking up more shares, they're racking up more comments. And if the first wave was much more of a general audience, like everyone was sharing them with friends and family, this wave is smaller, but they're a very activated group of people. Like this example of the message here, it's a very classic one. It's about like 3 different, conspiracy theories in one message. It starts off saying that COVID-19 is a bacteria. It ends by saying you can treat it with aspirin. There's some mention of Bill Gates there in the middle. And this is very typical. And I think the problem with this is that the first wave was very easy to fact check. Like if we saw a message that said there's a lockdown, or that says you could treat coronavirus with drinking tea, we could say, okay, we can fact check that. That's straightforward. But when we see a message like this that says, 10 different things, it's very difficult for fact checkers to try and do their job with that. And also, I think the other bar is that people who are sharing these second wave messages, they're not necessarily going to believe fact checks. If they believe that Bill Gates is behind coronavirus, just because we say, no, we checked this, he's not, it's not man-made, they're not going to be the ones saying, oh, my mistake, I will not share this message anymore. So it's very difficult. It's very difficult for fact checkers at the moment, I think.
Nicola, when you were fact checking in the UK for COVID, was your experience similar to that of Christine's, or what was the majority of your fact checking team spending their time on?
Yeah, I think it's very similar, particularly the claims, the breadth of claims that you mentioned there, Christine. We also saw the kind of list posts where you would have sort of 10 claims in the one Facebook post, and it's really difficult for us to be able to fact check that. I think the other thing I would say is that there's a real difficulty in making sure that you have the expertise to be able to fact check and be able to fact check quickly. So FullFact was really lucky that we had an epidemiologist on our staff at the beginning of the year when the outbreak first started. But otherwise, it's been really difficult to get access to the medical expertise to give a view on whether these claims, have any accuracy to it. Things like gargling salt water can help. That was a claim that I know spread across Europe, but actually, it was really hard to get a medical voice to say definitively, yes or no, does that help? So that's definitely been tough. I think we've seen a lot, or what's been really interesting is that a lot of the stories, or a lot of the claims that have been spreading across different countries have been very, very similar. So again, you mentioned Bill Gates, we spoke about 5G. These are all claims that we've seen in the UK as well. Anti-vaccination claims, it's all the same stuff, and it's all tying into the same fears and anxieties that you mentioned there, Christine. So yeah, it's been a very similar, difficult experience.
Yeah.
Over the last few years, one of the things that we've noticed is a lot of our fact checks are fact-checking politicians or government, or things like how many houses the government built over the last 5 years. For coronavirus, we were doing fewer fact checks about particular statements from state authorities or from government. Was that the same in the UK?
So I think we started off in the pandemic with doing a lot more of the claims that we saw on social media, and particularly through the third-party fact-checking program on Facebook, as I've mentioned before. So a lot of conspiracy theories, but that's sort of died down a little bit, and you know, the newspapers aren't publishing those claims, which is really helpful. So we are fact checking a lot of the statements that government are putting out. So things like the statistics around testing figures is an example of claims that we will check. So there has been a lot of that, particularly in government. But I think that's more like our bread and butter, actually. You know, it's easier to fact check statistics like that than these conspiracy theories on Facebook.
Per, there's kind of the two waves that Christine talked about there. The kind of first is more misinformation that people are sharing for with their friends and family, and then there's the disinformation. Do you have theories, or do you have research into who creates both waves? Are they the same people that create both waves? Why do people create these messages that end up going viral on WhatsApp or Facebook or other social media platforms?
One of the challenges with this job is that basically people tend not to compute facts, but rather stories. So the producers of disinformation, they are not really producing lies, they're producing attractive stories about, for instance, the corrupt government or powerful big pharma corporations, etc. This all sounds very nasty, and you create this kind of stories that are attractive to produce. And as those who relay these stories, they feel that they are taking part in a campaign for truth, actually, than rather spreading lies. So the core problem here is to be able to counter these attractive stories about the big conspiracies, the powerful elites, the bankers, the whoever are spreading these things. This is the challenge, and this is why disinformation so easily spread.
Billy, is there appetite in Europe? Has that appetite grown to tackle this, to actually, like Per is saying, very hard to tackle these attractive stories? We need to think innovatively about doing that. Is there people in your circles now who do think deeply about this, who want to fix it, and how are they going to go about it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about it. There was an action plan published by the Commission, but it just didn't function or work, so we're revisiting it again. The difficulty, of course, is when you start to assess disinformation and how it's spread, and misinformation, how it's disseminated around on the internet and social media. To control that, the fear is that you will risk freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and to get that balance is going to be very, very difficult. But there is inherently a view now that we have to do something, because we can't allow a situation where, look, COVID is obviously the most immediate issue we're discussing, and the disinformation that was spread about that. A lot of that was done very, very maliciously. It wasn't just people planting stories, but there were entities were planting stories to undermine states, to undermine health services across the European Union. So there was quite a nefarious effort by some actors in this particular area. But beyond that, the big challenge will be to our democracies, to the functioning of governments, to interference in elections. And that has been very evident even in the context of Brexit, in the States, and in some regional elections already in the European Union. You've seen interference from outside actors, from outside the European Union itself. So we can't allow that to happen. So the trick is to get the balance between what is policing the internet and what is making sure we don't interfere with freedom of expression and freedom of speech. But like for example, the 5G, that was being pushed quite a lot from what we can gather by Russia in particular, or by elements within Russia. And of course, this is just to slow the potential rollout of 5G. 5G will give an economy greater advantages over those that don't have 5G. So it's also being used as a ploy to delay economies from coming back out of the COVID crisis, and undermining confidence in governments in particular. But just like one particular simple case was the army were coming onto the streets. That was a big rumour that just started at the very start of COVID. And I was standing outside my old constituency office in Cork, and there was two women saying, "Oh, Billy, we heard that the army are coming on. It's very sad for our country that our country's been taken over by the army." And I was trying to explain that, look, this was not going to happen. And of course, as I was, there was 2 army trucks on the way up to Collins Barracks drove beyond me. So it undermined my ability to convince them that it wasn't the case. But they had heard that from a friend who had read it from some other person's daughter's WhatsApp grouping, and it just kept spreading. But that's at a local level. But that undermined the confidence of those people in their own community, but you can undermine confidence of a population in its government or in its health services. We were lucky in Ireland. Because the government got ahead of it, in fairness. And Tony Holohan, for example, the chief medical officer, was very much out front. He became a very trusted figure. So we were very lucky. And we're not targeted as much as other countries by nefarious actors. We're lucky that way, but that won't last forever either.
I just want to bring in a question from one of our audience members, Tig Nagel. Per, you might answer this before we go on. Is there a difference between disinformation and misinformation? And if so, do they require different mitigation strategies? Because it brings in a little bit of what Billy was saying there about local and more EU policies.
Yes, I didn't hear the beginning of the questions, but yes, obviously there are differences in approaches very much, and basically they are very, very much developing skills in fine-tuning approaches to reach a certain target audience. So yes.
That's the main difference between misinformation and disinformation?
Well, systematically, we follow only what we can consider disinformation, that is with malign intent and that is verifiably false. And we're also only following channels that are, in one way or another, strongly connected to Russian state structures.
Nicola, for you, the strategies for dealing with misinformation and or disinformation, how do you tackle that on a more local level, like in a UK fact-checking organisation?
Yeah, I agree there's definitely a difference between misinformation and disinformation, and the biggest difference is that intent. What I would say though is that at FullFact, for the most part, we don't presume what the intention is of the person who is creating or sharing false claims. We always give people the benefit of the doubt and give them the opportunity to correct it. That's our preferred outcome, is that people correct themselves. So within FullFact, we don't really make that distinction. But I would say that there is a wider requirement for a kind of proportional response. I think that disinformation, where you have clear evidence that somebody, a hostile actor of some sort, is deliberately trying to cause harm, then that requires a kind of more tougher response than misinformation. Nobody wants to be accusing their great aunt of trying to cause harm in the same way that we would other hostile actors. So yeah, I think the key difference is around kind of education, but also how the internet companies respond as well. I think they have to play a huge part in this and take responsibility for being the key factor that's causing a lot of these false stories to spread to such a wider audience. Before social media, you would talk to your friends in the pub, and now it's going across Europe, across the world.
Yeah, the OR number is a lot higher now that we have social media. Christine, I saw you nodding away there, but before we get into the social media companies, just wanted to ask about the journals ramping up, because you mentioned earlier that it's not something that we've had to deal with before, but we obviously did have a fact-checking initiative. But how do you scale up the team to deal with it at a local level, like what Billy was saying, when there's 2 women on the street, being quite upset that the army is coming because they believe that WhatsApp message. So how did you ramp up the team? What was the response? And I guess any lessons from that as well?
So our whole thing was, we decided to treat fact checks in the same way that we would usually focus on the way we'd usually treat breaking news. So we used to spend probably around 2 days, a reporter would spend about 2 days working on a fact check, writing it, getting over the line, sometimes more, sometimes a bit less. But with coronavirus, we just had to be a lot more nimble and focus on debunking stories instead, because like Billy says, if these women are talking about the army being on the streets, you need to, and that's causing harm to people. Like, people are reading things that could affect their lives. If they think that, drinking tea is going to prevent them from getting coronavirus, or, some of the really dodgy health things that were shared, health approaches that were shared on Facebook in particular and on WhatsApp, it kind of felt like we don't have time to sit around and spend like 4 days on a fact check when there are people out there and it may be affecting actual people's lives. So what we did was our team of 20 reporters are all trained in fact checks So we were able to scale up the volume really quickly and prioritize the fact checks over other stories that we would have been working on instead. And so as a point of comparison, we did, in March and April last year, which is in 2019, we did a total of 7 fact checks across the entire 2 months. And in March of April and this year, we did 53, which was almost 1 a day. And it's not like there was nothing happening in March of April last year. It was just that there was so much misinformation this year that it made sense. Like like sometimes as journalists, you want to feel useful. And I think we really felt useful in terms of being able to do this and being able to say, here, you got that message on WhatsApp today. Here's a debunk. Look, that is not true. Don't believe it. And I think we set up a WhatsApp account, as we've mentioned, so that people could forward us on the messages they saw and fact check, which was really helpful. It was, and it also made us realize that, there were a couple of messages that we would have gotten maybe a couple of 100 times. So while it's hard to gauge how much a message is being shared on WhatsApp, if several hundred people made the effort to go and, read the journal, find the WhatsApp number and send it on, I think you can extrapolate that the number of people who actually received the message was probably an awful lot higher.
Yeah, and one of the things that you and Nicola both said is a lot of these things, they have common threads between a lot of the false stories were the same false stories that were happening in Germany or Singapore or Australia. So is there something in fact checkers coming together in a more seamless manner to counter this rather than being a bit more reactive?
Yeah, I think so. And FullFact, where Nicola works, actually put out a great report this week. She might be mentioning this, but it talks about the trends in 5 European countries. And Ireland isn't included, but it's very similar to our experience. It talks about, 5G, health, cures, vaccine. Bill Gates gets his own section, and it's really interesting. So I think it's well worth a read for anybody who wants to take a look afterwards. But so among fact checkers, we had a kind of a network of fact checkers before last year. It was actually for the European elections. It was the first time we set up kind of this huge cross-country alliance. It was looking at trends, they spread, making them fact checks available to the public. So it was like a practice run for coronavirus in some ways. To be totally honest, it didn't have a huge impact because there just wasn't the same volume of misinformation as there has been now. But what it did do was it allowed us to understand the logistics of it and the scale. So when the pandemic started and fact checkers were seeing all the same things around the world, we set up a network called the Coronavirus Facts Alliance. And we were able to use the learnings from the European election network and kind of create this huge network that had never been done before. So it was almost 100 fact checkers around the world, including the journal, sharing fact checks, sharing them with the public. And I think in the end, we published almost 7,000 fact checks in total, got like 1 million page views. And it was great. It was really, impressive just to see this kind of coming together of fact checks to be able to try and stop the misinformation from being shared. And I know the head of the International Fact Checking Network was talking about this last week, and she said that the collaboration has proved that collaboration is much stronger than any law or regulation could be in stopping misinformation. And I don't fully agree. I think it's something to kind of chew over. I think we do need laws and regulations for the social media platforms because they're the ones that are allowing false news to spread. But I think the collaboration has shown what can be done. So it's more of a starting point rather than a bandage or the full treatment. If that makes sense.
Billy, there's a question from an audience member, Aitken O'Brien, along the same lines. He says, we seem to only be able to react to disinformation. What proactive steps can be taken on both a national and an EU level to counter disinformation rather than just react to it?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just the spontaneity of the internet and social media is the challenge. But I mean, we do have to get to a stage where we have to accept that Europe has to play a lead role in this. I don't think that at a nation state level we can address this. So the European Union must become to the fore. There has to be stronger collaboration between the member states. We have to, for example, we have to have a database put in place across the European Union. So the actors that are involved in this, or the entities that are involved in disinformation, at least they, we can track them to some extent on an international basis and track them from that perspective. We also need to ensure that the platforms hosting have obligations as well, and that clearly, they have very detailed algorithms now, for example. So, they can really pinpoint cohorts of people, age profiles, regional areas, so they can really drill down to certain cohorts and target them. So we need to be conscious of that as well. The other key area that's critically important, this goes back to fact check, is we have to have a robust independent media that's well resourced. And of course, the media across Europe is going through a very difficult time because of COVID, but even in advance of that, we've seen a rapid drop in the mainstream media from the point of view of loss of income. And that is undermining the ability of journalists to go along, to investigate, to fact check, to analyze a story, to see where it's coming from and who's propagating it. And that requires resourcing. So the media is a fundamental cornerstone in our democracies. We've always said that, but in the context of where we are now with regard to disinformation across media platforms and social media platforms, we need to have a strong independent media that's really resourced, and that's going to be a huge challenge. But just the European Union itself.
Where will those resources come from, Billy?
Well, I think we have to be creative as governments and as people. I mean, we have to support the media, and that might require direct support into the media. For example, I mean, local papers, regional papers, they are all struggling. You can lose them, but you lose an entity that actually does provide verifiable information to the community. You go to national media, they will have to be resourced as well. So, I mean, these things sometimes have to be resourced by the taxpayer if we are to ensure that we have a robust, independent capability to actually address the problems of disinformation. So, I mean, there are choices and you have the direct resourcing. But I mean, if we continue as we are, we'll end up with a social media platform being the only outlet for many people with lots of disinformation and misinformation. And that simply is not good for the individual citizen, and it's certainly not good from a democratic point of view and from the government's point of view. So, but the European Union is taking this very seriously, and it's just not because of COVID, but it is beyond that. We've seen, and there's detailed dossiers now of interference in countries' elections process and the running of a state. So, and reference to be made to Russia. Russia is a very, very big actor in all of this. It really is beginning to undermine the European Union. It is a policy of Russia to undermine the European Union. So, for example, in recent times, because of COVID, you would see targeted interventions at immigrant communities across the European Union, that they were being blamed for COVID. It was migrants coming from Africa, it was migrants coming from Syria, and this was really being pushed out. Disinformation. But that was to pit people against each other in countries with high immigrant populations. So you have all that, and that is all done because they have detailed research and algorithms available to them.
Per, is that your experience? And do you think that there's more that can be done to counter disinformation rather than just react to it?
I think that, as Billy says, professional journalism is a very, very good remedy against disinformation, and especially local community journalism. Small newspapers that are professionally run with professional journalists who are able to understand the difference between like random claims and real facts. And this is part of the activities that we are doing in our team. We have a task to perform trainings for member state journalists. We are engaged in different kind of projects for raising awareness on disinformation. We're maintaining a database, a perfectly public, available database with currently around 9,000 cases of disinformation, where you can study patterns and tropes and topics and tendencies on disinformation. How it's spread, how it's done, who is spreading, and who is saying what. So stuff can be done, and we also have a very, very strong element of proactive work in our team. We are reaching out to the journalists in Eastern Europe, in partnerships countries, in Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia and everywhere, to enhance the professionalism and to stop normal media being used as platforms for malign disinformation. So lots of things are being done, but obviously you can never outshout clever liars. They will always be heard, but we can always demonstrate that we don't accept this.
Nicola, I just want to ask you to put your your previous role in mind for a minute, because obviously Brexit is looming, and we're talking a lot about what the EU can do. Will the UK stay aligned to those EU efforts? Is this a problem that the UK government have acknowledged? And what's their commitment to looking to solve it, or, as our audience member said, counter it rather than react to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that collaboration, not just with the EU, but worldwide, is going to be really critical to tackling a lot of these problems. And, you know, Christine, thank you very much for plugging our recent report that came out this week, where we worked with fact checkers in France, Germany, Spain, and Italy to, you know, compare trends that FullFact had seen. In terms of the UK government tackling this issue, they have proposed legislation, legislation that's quite similar to the online safety bill in Ireland. And you know, potentially going along similar lines as the Digital Services Act that the EU is thinking about. So I think that actually, you know, a lot of countries around the world are looking to do similar things when it comes to regulation and legislation, and collaboration will only make all of that stronger. So yeah, the UK definitely recognises that disinformation is a problem. We had a very particular disinformation response from Russia in 2017 when the Salisbury poisonings happened. That was, you know, a very clear-cut example of them trying to undermine the government's messaging. So ever since then, you know, this problem has been taken seriously in the UK. And hopefully,
what kind of examples could you just give us a few, because it probably wasn't something that we saw here in Ireland?
Yeah, sure. So, so yeah, in 2017 there was the poisoning of the Skripals in Salisbury, and almost immediately after that, we saw a huge campaign from the Russian state media, specifically to just put out so many different narratives around what could have happened there. So I think in total it was around 45 different narratives that came out of Russian state media, so people like RT and others, and that really ranged from, you know, kind of very potentially plausible claims like it was a, you know, mistake from Porton Down, which was which is just located down the road from Salisbury, to the kind of, you know, a bit ridiculous that, you know, Theresa May had orchestrated it to distract from Brexit, to the completely ridiculous that it was actually Yulia Skripal's mother-in-law who didn't like her and was trying to take her out. So we saw this huge campaign to try and undermine the UK government messaging that actually, you know, it was Russia, the Russian state, who was to blame for this. Thankfully, none of those narratives really seemed to take hold in the UK population, at least. And I think one of the key reasons for that was because the UK government tracked all of those different narratives and made it public. You know, they published a list that said, you know, here are 20 different narratives that we have seen. Here are the links to the news pages that are getting put out. You know, make the judgment for yourself and see how ridiculous this is yourself. So I think that actually there is an education point when we talk about how we counter this stuff. We need to make people aware that there are hostile actors out there who are trying to manipulate their opinion. We need to make them cautious of that, and we need to be honest with them when it does happen and say, look, here are some of the stories that are clearly false.
We're kind of getting towards solutions there, but Christine, along with solutions, there are a lot of challenges. What do you think are the main challenges if we are kind of agreed that giving audiences information and you know, growing media literacy and fact checking being really important to that? What are the challenges to the media and in particular fact checkers to be able to continue doing this and not just react to it but actually counter it so it doesn't land?
Well, look, I think the biggest one is the role and responsibility of the social media platforms, so say Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, YouTube, in combating misinformation, because, you know, they're the places where misinformation happens, like they're how it spreads. And so they are not taking responsibility for cleaning up. They're putting that responsibility onto others. In some cases, they're not doing anything at all. I think we're at a really interesting moment right now, because we've seen them doing probably more in the last, Facebook and Twitter in particular, probably have done more in the last month on trying to take baby steps to combat misinformation than they've ever done before. So I think we're going to see, I think when we look back in 2020, I think it's going to be like a landmark year in terms of saying, like, this is when the platforms had the opportunity to try and clamp down on misinformation or try and do something different from what they've been doing. Did they take that opportunity or not? And like, so much of it is grounded in the fact that because they're US companies, they place so much importance on free speech rather than the damage caused by free speech. And now we're seeing the pressure being put on them by, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, which is pushing them to take responsibility for what's posted on their sites. And also because of, to be fair, Twitter moved a few weeks ago to start labeling some of Trump's tweets, which I think has kind of helped start this snowball effect. So we'll see where that lands. But I think they've got so much power and they've got so much that they could be doing. I think that for the platforms to actually do something about this now, it's just a huge moment for misinformation. Nicola alluded to Facebook doing the third-party fact-checking program, where they basically outsource fact-checking to other organizations, including us, including FullFact. And that's one way to try and reduce misinformation on Facebook, to try and stop people from engaging with it, which has worked really well during coronavirus. It's a lot more than other platforms are doing. There are problems with the system. The main one is that Facebook won't let political speech be fact-checked. It says political speech is in the public interest, and it made a tiny concession on it last week. It's such a small concession, but it was something. Twitter is much more ad hoc. You've seen the little labels on Trump's tweets, which was progress. And I think it was just the fact that Twitter took a stance on it was a huge deal. The fact that Twitter actually said, you know what, we are paying attention and we are doing something about it. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with those.
We have a very related question for Billy from Mark Coughlin from RT, who's in the audience there. Talking about European level stuff and media is one thing, but given Facebook is regulated in Ireland and much of the misinformation is actually on Facebook, and obviously we've seen on WhatsApp, have you considered speaking to the Taoiseach about it generally, because it obviously is an area of interest to you? Or have you examined possibilities outside of media, like an independent Irish-based fact-checking regulator style service?
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty is if you put all the obligations on social media platforms without any democratic accountability or oversight beyond that, well, then effectively you're saying to media platforms that they are entitled to decide what information is disseminated on their platform. And that in a way gives huge companies awesome power in terms of what they could decide would be disseminated in certain countries. So I think if we actually want to have the social media platforms involved in this process, there'll have to be some accountability over that. In other words, not just left to the company themselves, but that there's strict guidelines drawn up, that there's some form of broadcasting commission oversight, just like you have for the press at the moment. And we need to move it towards the social media platforms as well, because otherwise you're effectively saying, you decide what is suitable and what is not suitable. And I would be concerned that companies could decide, well, look, they might take a certain view on politics. They might be advocating one particular political party over another. And without that being obvious to the public, well, then that is in itself a form of censorship. And that would be a major problem. From an Irish perspective, look, we have to deal with this at a European level. If the United Kingdom, with Brexit and all of that, but I still think beyond that, the whole of the European Union certainly would be a good start, and that would put pressure on other countries across the globe that want to deal with this as well. From an Irish perspective, Facebook obviously is located here. It has a major impact here, but the idea that we can police the entire operation through Ireland, is just not possible. It has to be done at a European level and probably beyond that as well at some stage. But I certainly think we have to put a lot of thought into how we have some form of oversight to ensure that companies like Facebooks and Googles and all the rest of them, that they actually have guidelines laid down that are in some way in the interest of the citizen as opposed to the interest of an entity or the company.
Is it something that you will talk to Micheál Martin about? Obviously, you now have a Taoiseach who's in your own party. You've probably a more friendly ear. Yeah,
well, look, I mean, we're a part of the Renew Group, and the Renew Group is very involved in this at a European level. I mean, we have put forward proposals. We are very intent on ensuring that the European Union will move collectively on this particular issue. So we've published quite a lot of detail on this particular issue, and I would be very hopeful, obviously, that the ministers are directly involved, but the Taoiseach himself, Micheál Martin, would push this at council level as well. This is not just about COVID and misinformation around the last 6 months. This is about how we protect our democracies, how we underpin confidence in our political systems, and that people actually have access to information that's correct and can be verified and fact-checked. And if there is disinformation, that it can be shown to be disinformation.
Where do you think the social media companies and platforms lie in the solution to this? Or even is there a solution to this?
I don't think we can expect a easy silver bullet to solve this problem once and for all. This is a complicated dialogue, and this dialogue is ongoing, and this has to be performed by Facebook users and state and overstate authorities, as well as with the commercial actors. Pressure has been put forward from all possible parts of the the network, so to say. And I think this dialogue is ongoing, and that we see that Twitter and Facebook occasionally are listening, paying attention to these concerns. We see the other commercial actors react that their advertising end up in disinformation websites. It's not really what they want always. So the dialogue continues and must continue, where EU and member states and everyone is participating.
Nicola, from your point of view, FullFact is a fact-checking charity. It's an organization that relies on donations. Is that a sustainable model? Is it a replicable model for other countries?
I mean, I wouldn't want to comment on what the situations are in other countries. Certainly within the UK, as I say, the FullFact's been running for 10 years. We've been a registered charity for a few years now, not the full 10 years. I can't remember off the top of my head how long. So we are dependent on donations. I should say that we also get funding from Facebook, obviously through the third-party fact-checking program, but other grants as well, and Google also give us grants. So that certainly helps a lot with making sure that we are sustainable, and we get other grants too. All of our funding is published on our website. But I think that being a charity is really important because it means that we can be seen to be independent and be seen to be authoritative without having questions about any kind of biases that we might have based on our funding model.
We're getting loads of questions in, so I'm just going to ask a couple of last questions, and then we'll move to kind of fully audience questions. Christine, we've talked a lot about how COVID brought misinformation on a large scale to Ireland. Is it here to stay?
Yeah, I do wonder a lot about that, and it's hard to be definitive because we're still really in the middle of it. But there's a couple of things that make me think that it could be. The main reason is that a lot of the pages and groups that, particularly on Facebook, that have been sharing information about coronavirus, they're now moving on to share information about other topics, and misinformation is being weaved into them. So you might see, say, a coronavirus updates group that was posting purely about it, and now they're starting to ask questions about the new government, or things that are maybe adjacent. They might say, the new government's going to make the vaccine mandatory when there is one, or that the government, like I said earlier, that the country's going to move to a cashless society, so the government can keep an eye on everyone. So it's kind of a mission creep. They've got these engaged audiences that turned up for one thing, and now they're starting to be fed kind of a diet of misinformation, or just have misinformation just kind of slowly brought in places where they may not have expected to see it before. And it's still relatively small, but they didn't exist before, and now they're here. And that's the thing that makes me think that suddenly people are seeing posts about posts about things that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to see before this. And there was one post that 2 weeks ago, it said that Leo Varadkar, when he was still Taoiseach, was going to the Supreme Court to make every Irish person in the country have to get the vaccine. And I don't even know how that started, or sometimes there's a grain of truth in these things, and obviously there was no grain of truth whatsoever, but it was still being shared, and it was still, it got over 100 shares or over 100 comments, and that kind of thing I think is the area of concern. And then the other thing as well, the other thing that makes me a bit concerned is that a lot of people got their news from social media during the pandemic. We know the first case in Ireland was on February 29th, and the government at the time wouldn't say where it was, where the one case was, but the location was being shared on local and national Facebook pages, in WhatsApp groups and Twitter. I have family who live in Glasnevin, close to where the case was, and they all knew, they all immediately, and they were massively concerned as well, because, they were getting it from these pages and it wasn't official. So they were like, what isn't being said to us now? And there were other moments like that too on social media when information was available for unofficial sources. So I guess my concern would be that it might have created the expectation that people could get real news, I use that word very loosely for real news, about what was happening from these places, from like neighborhood WhatsApp groups or from Facebook pages, and not necessarily from authorities. Like there's a little bit of distrust there, a little bit of reliance on these groups rather than the official sources. So, hopefully, like I think in a year's time, we'll know for sure. We'll be able to say, was this a turning point, or was Ireland able to bounce back to low levels of misinformation, or actually was this the thing that did bring it to Ireland, that did change things for Ireland?
Here, I looked at your disinformation database, and Ireland doesn't appear very often, so the pro-Kremlin sourced disinformation. Our latest one was in May, where there was a piece of false news put out that we had banned the use of the words husband and wife in Ireland, which is obviously not true. But there was obviously a kernel of truth, because gender neutral language, the UN has said spouse is often better than using husband and wife. But Ireland hasn't been very susceptible to pro-Kremlin sourced disinformation. Because of everything that Christine said there, are we more, is there an opportunity there now for it to be infiltrated a bit more?
Well, yes, of course, we can see these tendencies very clearly. We can see also that there is always a potential that Ireland might be a priority for a pro-Kremlin disinformation campaign. I mean, they're delivering skills, they are developing skills, they are learning to understand the sentiment in the target audience of Ireland, for instance. So the attempts to piggyback on this kind of stories, it's obvious they want to have the possibility to use this as a means of contacting the Irish public and the influencing of the Irish public discourse.
I'm going to just prepare myself with some of your questions from the audience, but while I do that, I think Nikki is going to have the poll results from the first few questions. It will just be interesting to see what people came across over the last few months. So there was about 115 participants at the peak. How often do you come across misinformation about COVID-19? Hourly, very low percentage, 3%; daily, 44%, pretty high; weekly, 38%; and monthly, 15%. Have you ever repeated a fact about COVID that later turned out to be false? And I was really interested in this one because obviously this group is self-selecting. You are appearing at a conference about misinformation, but even with that self-selecting group, 32%, 22 people have repeated a fact that later turned out to be false. 38% said no, and 29% are unsure, which obviously makes sense. You're never quite sure if something you've said is true or not. Has a family or friend ever repeated COVID-19 misinformation to you? I think we all probably knew this was going to be high, 84%. And as we talked about, it is hard then to tell your aunt or your lovely neighbor that actually what they're telling you is false, and you don't want to embarrass them. And have you ever corrected a friend or family member? 85%. So most of you did not feel embarrassed about doing that and went ahead anyway. So that is excellent. I'm going to get some questions ready. I think we had another poll just as well, because we had been talking about the responsibility of who needs to help counter this and react to disinformation. So around the funding of fact checkers, whether it is the media itself, whether it's the government's job, whether it is social media platforms to be the main funder. So Nikki's going to put up that poll now, and also to ask if governments are doing enough to counter disinformation. Right, we'll go to those answers at the end, but I'm just going to take some questions now from the audience. Christine or Nicola, you might be best placed to answer this from Linton Hartle. How many major news organisations have investigative journalists, and what's the difference between normal journalism stories and investigative story journalism?
It's very hard to say. Like in Ireland, if you think about where we might have investigative journalism, you immediately think of like RTE, the Irish Times, the Independent, the Examiner, the Journal. We do investigative work. So I think for a lot of newsrooms, investigative work is baked in, but at the same time, it's one of the most expensive areas of journalism. And Nicola was talking about the cost there. Like obviously fact checks cost a lot of money. It's resources, it's knowledge, it's skilled, it's expensive. Investigative journalism is the same. It's all of those things. It needs more money than just than a lot of other types of newsrooms. So, and there's so much pressure on newsrooms right now that when places are looking to cut money, I think investigative journalism or fact checks can be on the chopping block because of the pure maths involved. So, I think my answer would be that like a lot of newsrooms would try to do as much investigative journalism as they can afford or as they're able to do, because it's kind of, for journalists, like that's your bread and butter, like you want to be able to do those stories, but it's just not always available depending on the resources.
Nicola, you might have an answer to that as well, but I'll just give you another question from the same audience member. But what is the best method to discern fact from fiction as someone who is just reading the news, not creating the news? Is there a basic strategy they want to know?
Yes, I'll start with the question of investigative journalism. I think the key thing from my perspective is that investigative journalism is not just, you know, reporting information as it comes through. It's really digging into the detail of what a story is and why it came about and what's the background to it. And they often do take a lot longer, as Christine was saying, and are therefore, you know, more kind of resource intensive. But I think it's really critical to our understanding of the news to be able to go beyond that kind of surface level reporting of an incident that might have happened, to go deeper into why it's happened. And sometimes that can be difficult because a lot of what we want to read nowadays is we want the short, snappy version of a story, but actually to counter things like disinformation, it's really important that we understand some of the complexities, or at least recognize when there are complexities, and it's not necessarily, you know, you can't just read a headline and understand what the story is. So maybe that's my first tip if you're trying to discern fact from fiction. The FullFact is actually just on Tuesday launched a new media literacy campaign with Facebook, which is running throughout this month. And within that, we point to 3 simple questions that you should be asking yourself when you read anything online. The first is, where is it from? So, you know, take the time to look at the source. Do you recognize it? If you don't recognize it, maybe take the time to Google it and see if there's any information that you can glean from it. The second question is, what's missing? So again, just pause, think about what's, you know, not being said, what you read between the lines a little bit. And the third one, and possibly the most important one, is how does it make you feel? Because if there's a story that really makes you feel angry or upset, then, you know, really interrogate why that's happening. Is that deliberate? That's a really common tactic that particularly disinformation actors will use to try and mislead people, is to put these really sensationalist stories out there that plug into your emotions, and people who feel emotional about a story are more likely to share it themselves. So really interrogate how it makes you feel and why is that the case.
There's a really good follow-on question from Stephen McMahon here, who asks if there is lessons that can be applied from the COVID-19 strategy of civil organisations joining with establishments to counter the misinformation, and can we engage with people who believe these false stories and drives them to accept them? Per, you may be able to talk about this. What drives people to believe these, you know, conspiracy theories or false news stories?
Well, exactly as I said before, good stories, good storytelling, a good lie is always present. You react to it emotionally, and you have this kind of feeling, God, this needs to be informed. I need to tell everyone else about it. Then you will likely be a piece of disinformation here. And understanding these mechanisms is only done when we're talking about this problem permanently, when journalists are engaging in this kind of activities, when civil society is, when state is, everyone is supposed to be engaging in this.
Sinead, can I jump in on that? Like, I think it's important to say, like, I don't think anybody wants to be the person in the WhatsApp group that's sending the misinformation. You know, no, I don't think a lot of times people realize that they're doing it. So I think it's about giving people the tools to kind of, to the media literacy tools, to kind of realize, are they the person doing it? Like, no, you know, you don't want to be people, you don't want to have people pointing out to you, actually, that's not true, you're sharing that dodgy stuff again. And I think a really important thing here is educating older people who have not grown up with the internet and who may not necessarily have the same kind of critical skills maybe that younger people may have grown up with. And I'm using the terms younger and older very loosely there. I'm not going to put like an age I'm not going to define the ages or anything, but I think, you know, when I look at the where the misinformation is coming from on Facebook every day, so much of it is coming from people who are older and who probably are well intentioned but just don't have, you know, they for them it's very, there might be a difficulty in telling, is it a legitimate Facebook page or is it not, because all the information looks the same on Facebook, and it can be hard to know how to judge that. So I think that is a really key part of trying to combat this and seeing what we can do.
Billy, a question, I think that's probably a good one for you to look at, from Eileen Cullity. Is there a danger that focusing on Russia specifically misrepresents the scale of the problem? Disinformation about migrants and open borders came from far-right actors in Europe, and investigations have found that China and India also ran influence campaigns.
Oh yes, I mean, but it's just that Russia is so prevalent in its involvement in these particular areas. But I mean, it's the same. Other countries, are undermining neighbouring states, etc. So I mean, it's not just Russia, but I mean, Russia is a predominant actor and influencer in particularly in the Eastern European part of the European Union. So we have to be very conscious of that. But I mean, beyond that, yes, you will have interference from India. Will be, using its influence to undermine certain aspects of other countries and vice versa. I mean, like a lot of these countries are allowing these things to happen because they see it in their national interest to undermine a neighbour or to weaken another country that maybe it might be in dispute with or might be in competition with in terms of trade, etc. So it's not just Russia versus Europe; it is global. But the point is, I mean, we have to start somewhere, and certainly from a European perspective, we have to start a verification process so that, in other words, we build up a database of these people that are, and these entities that are involved in disseminating disinformation, that we can at least collate that type of information. We have to have violent content, for example, is flagged. We have to be able to flag something to be verified. So we have to start getting really involved in how the platform providers, disseminate that information. And the other critically important thing that was referenced there earlier on, we have to empower citizens. We have to educate citizens so that they have the confidence and the tools to actually check whether or not this information has been verified, whether or not it is part of this information process. So we need to empower at all levels. But just like the Digital Services Act is coming out in the end of this year, that's a European Union piece of legislation, and hopefully that will underpin a lot of what is required to be done, both by countries and by social media platforms and other stakeholders as well. And hopefully that will start a further discussion then about how we actually really support an independent media, a vibrant media in the European Union that can hold these to account and hold governments to account and advocate for society. I mean, that's a fundamental. It's not just about fact checkers checking out disinformation on social media. It's also about ensuring that they hold governments to account and politicians to account and do what they've been doing for years, which is advocating for citizens and holding authority to account.
On that media literacy question, Christine, Sarah Nolan asks, is Ireland a media literate nation, and does media illiteracy assist in the spread of misinformation?
I think for the second part of the question, it's definitely a yes. I mean, if people have difficulties in identifying, true stories from false stories, then that's a real something that will add to levels of misinformation. I don't know where Ireland ranks compared to other countries. I'd be interested in knowing more about that. I mean, I presume the implication of the question is that we have higher levels of media literacy, and maybe that's helped to contribute to the lower levels of misinformation here, which I think isn't a bad theory. So I don't know the answer, but I will look into it afterwards.
A couple of similar questions for you, Nicola, around the work of fact checkers. Holly Kilroy asks about the sharing and analysis of disinformation incidents. Is that done? Is there databases between organisations? I know we mentioned the Corona Facts Alliance, sorry, just lost the other one. Fintan O'Donnell asks about the main sources of data used by fact checkers to check claims and if there are challenges in finding and using this data.
Yeah, so I'll start with the first point there. So I do think that collaboration is really critical, and I think that it could be increased. So you mentioned the International Fact-Checking Network Coronavirus Database. That's really a new thing that has come about because of this particular crisis. I know there have been other efforts around particular political points. So there was some collaboration around the UK election in December. The European election has already been mentioned, but I think that's definitely something that we could work on and see more of. In terms of where we get the data to be able to fact check. So at FullFact, we think it's really important to show our workings and show our sources. So we will always link to the source that we have used to come to a conclusion about a claim. As I said, that's usually a lot easier when it's, for example, a government statistic, because we can, link to the database. We've got the Office for National Statistics, which holds a lot of data as well. And so we will always link to that. It entirely depends on the claim though, and as I mentioned before, some of these claims that we've seen around coronavirus, around gargling salt water or I think one of my favourites actually was the claim that you could blow get your hair dryer and blow sort of hot air into your nose and that would like kill the virus. That's not true, by the way. That's the kind of thing. Obviously there isn't a database that we can link to, but we will try and get a medical expert to give an opinion that they're willing to go on the record and say, actually, as a medical expert, I don't believe that's true.
Yeah, it was one of the things we found actually when we started this. It was quite easy to get some of our like very high level medical experts on the phone, like on a Sunday night at 9 o'clock. They were really keen to make sure some of these, you know, were cut off at the pass, which I think is probably a difference maybe that Ireland has as well. Per, a question for you, because Russell Merriman says he was very interested in your take on making on what makes disinformation attractive, which he says raises the question, do the media bear some responsibility because of the drive to meet the competition of online by using more tabloid coverage or clickbait coverage? He said it might not be true in Ireland, but it might be true in the UK. So maybe Per and Nicola, you could take that. Maybe Per first.
Well, I mean, yes, as I'm a professional journalist myself, and I obviously know that journalism in most European countries are perfectly commercial organizations that need to attract an audience. It's always attractive to imagine that you can enhance your audience with clickbait and adding weird stuff and misleading headlines and what have you not. I think journalism is better than that. I don't think that professional journalists intentionally are spreading misinformation, but there is always like this temptation to cut corners, etc., in ethics and fact-checking. But I still believe in journalism. I still believe in professional journalism as a good part of this process.
Nicola, from your point of view, does that harm media literacy in the UK if newspapers themselves or broadcasters are engaging in misleading headlines or agenda-based stories?
I definitely think that misleading headlines and misleading newspaper stories is a problem, and we do fact check a lot of newspapers on a regular basis for things exactly like that. One of the trends that we've seen over the past few years has been misrepresentation and misreporting of polling, for example, so polling data. It actually takes a particular type of expertise to understand polling data and to be able to interpret that properly, and sometimes newspapers don't get that right. So yeah, I do think it is a problem. I think that I've been really encouraged with the newspapers in the UK during the coronavirus pandemic. I think they are maybe less so at the beginning, but certainly now are really taking steps to make sure that they're publishing good information about the pandemic, which is so important in such a moment of kind of critical information.
Per, you mentioned before to us about hahaganda. Can you just explain what the phrase hahaganda, because it does remind me of maybe some stories that Boris Johnson would have published as a columnist back in the day about the EU. So can you just explain to our audience what you mean by hahaganda and what falls into that territory?
Hahaganda is a method of spreading disinformation where you don't even have to actually claim that it's the truth. You can put forward any kind of stupid statement about the EU harmonizing the size of herring. And this is an example of how idiotic the bureaucrats of Brussels are. And then you say, no, it was only a joke. And still you rub in the message that EU is this kind of massive organization that is standardizing herring for the European audience. And this is an element we have chosen the word hahaganda, that is a combination of haha, joking, and propaganda. And it has proven very, very efficient, very hard to combat, actually. We view this as one of the major systems, methods of the attempts to influence on the public discourse. So it works, and it's very well spread, and probably I have fallen into the trap to write columns using this kind of element as well.
We have about 10 minutes left, so I'll just try to run through as many questions as I can. Billy, probably one for you here from our managing editor in Journal Media, Susan Daly. She's talking about Noteworthy, which is our investigative journalism platform at Journal Media. It was founded to test new sources of revenue precisely because of the difficulty of funding investigative work. As we talked about, it's extremely expensive work through regular commercial avenues. It's not always viable. Noteworthy works through a mix of grants and crowdfunding. It's obviously in its very early days. It's doing well, but should there be, she asks, a public service source of funding available specifically for investigative projects, given their impact? And we've definitely seen that in Ireland over the years.
Yes, I do. I think we have to, I said that earlier on, that we have to have a fully functioning investigative branch in journalism as well. It holds us honest as a people, as a government, as political parties and society, and it questions authority on behalf of citizens. So we have to have it. I mean, if you look at Ireland, I mean, you know, when media was going well in terms of good resources available because of the buoyant economy and strong advertising, there was some great investigative journalism and great investigative journalists. The other entity that had resources at the time was RTE. So you had Primetime Investigate, you had some wonderful journalists in the Irish Times and in the Independent as well. And I can think as far back, for example, as the late Veronica Guerin, for example, who would have been an investigative journalist as well, who would have been following things that weren't making news on a daily basis, but she was unearthing things and highlighting things. And that is not going to happen as much in the years ahead, because simply it costs a lot of money and you're chasing headlines the whole time to stay relevant as a journalist or as a newspaper or as a social media platform. So like that is the challenge. But if we value what we're talking about, well, then we have to fund it. And I think at this stage we have to have a mature discussion as a people, as political parties, about how we're paying the TV license, it funds RTE, but like we need to go beyond that and how we actually fund investigative journalism, that there will be some form of registering process. You go on a register as an investigative journalist and you perform those duties. But if we don't, we will be discussing, misinformation, disinformation, and the only way we'll be able to unearth scandals will be if they come up by accident, because and we can't depend on that being the case. We need investigative journalism. So I will be very much supportive of some entity to fund it, whereby you would actually make an application and that it will be overseen, one remove again, making sure it's independent from government and from the state, but that it would be funded to allow journalists investigate and carry out their duties.
Would you be optimistic that could happen in the lifetime of this government, given the person with responsibility for the media also has to look at tourism, sport, arts, culture and the Gaeltacht at the same time?
Well, I'd be optimistic from the point of view that I think we've accepted now as a people, but across Europe as well, that the mainstream media that we were used to did serve a very valuable purpose. And the disintegration of the mainstream media and the proliferation of online reporting is great in one way, but as you say, you can't hold it or you can't question it if you don't have the resources of investigative journalists or mainstream media. And in the case of a pandemic like this, when you need quality journalism to report facts to ensure that people are getting the right information and that it's relayed in a way that they can understand, is critically important. And if you don't have that, well, then you have great difficulties. Bearing in mind, if we didn't have the Journal, if we didn't have FactCheck, if we didn't have RT, if we didn't have the mainstream print media and local radio stations, how would a government disseminate the information about COVID-19? How would they actually get to people? If they were depending on social media sites, it would be very, very difficult because of disinformation and misinformation and how that's interpreted. So we have to have that debate, and the sooner the better, in my view. We can't lose a whole generation of young journalists that will see no opportunity in journalism because it is not resourced, and there isn't the opportunity to be an investigative journalist because there's no funds available to do that.
Nicola, question kind of linked to that about who should actually be the person, the people in charge of this. Hild asks, should the provision of reliable and evidence-based information not be an obligation of government in a democratic society?
I mean, yes, obviously we all want our governments to be giving out the best information and the most accurate information possible. I mean, I do think that there is a need And I think it's helpful to have independent organisations like fact checkers, but also the media. The media do a very good job of holding government to account for the information they put out as well. And I think that balance is important in a democratic society.
Christine, you've touched on this. Another question from Mark Coughlin. Fact checking is one thing, but if someone who is spreading these false stories aren't the kind of people who are inclined to accept the word of fact checking services, is there anything that can be done to speak directly to those people? I'm thinking maybe of those people who are on those Facebook groups that you see every day on the queue, you know, about maybe 5G or whatever it is. Is there anywhere that we can learn more about those people and how to engage with them?
Well, I think that this is like an ongoing tension for journalists and fact checkers, because sometimes it's about whether, if we do a fact check on a dodgy claim that's being shared by one of these groups, does it amplify it and does it galvanize the supporters of it? And there's no really easy answer to that. I think we've had a very small number of cases where, say, members of the extreme right in Ireland have made outrageous claims, but to a very, very small audience. And if we publish a fact check and it's read by 50,000 people, which is the average number of people who would read a fact check, we're giving that page an SEO bump. We're going to alert people to its presence. And so that's a real difficulty. So I think part of it is about, do you need, I mean, what can fact checkers actually do here, which I think is what Mark is asking. And I think part of it is trying to, you know, the platform should be looking at what they can do. How can they communicate with these groups? Should they be allowed? Should the groups be allowed to use these platforms to organize and disseminate this misinformation? And I think that that's kind of their responsibility. I think for fact checkers, the best thing you can do is try and get them in the platforms where they are. So, you know, if people are on Facebook, try and share the claims on Facebook. Maybe it's memes, maybe it's, you know, something that is shareable in that format on Facebook. There's a really good fact checking organization in Spain that does this, where they will literally create memes of things to try and stop other memes in their tracks, like to try and kind of counter misinformation with the true information, and making it very user friendly to share. And I think that's something we tried to do during coronavirus, by making similar memes. And look, I think that that's the most that fact checkers can really do at the moment. I don't think it's necessarily fact checkers' responsibility, I'd say, would be my main answer there.
Great. We're just coming towards the end. Just wanted to give the panelists opportunity if there is anything that they wanted to touch on today and make sure that they had said. Raise your hand, guys, if you want to just come in on anything. Otherwise, we'll go to our last poll results. Nicola?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of come back to my first point, actually, around preempting what's coming next. And Christine made a very good point that actually the first wave of misinformation around COVID-19 has passed, and we're into a kind of second wave now where people are kind of more understanding of what's happening. The lockdown rules are starting to change across different countries, and we're looking towards potentially a vaccine. So I think that lots of different stakeholders in the space, so government, the kind of public health organisations, the internet companies, we all need to be thinking about what are the harmful stories that might come next. Anti-vaccination content, for example, is a big one. And we need to be preparing now for that next wave.
Anything else? Guys, Christine?
I'll make this really, really fascinating, I promise. I think my main thing would just be, like, if for people leaving this like webinar, what you should be thinking about is, what can you do? Because we can all do something with this to try and stop misinformation and disinformation from being shared. So it could be, you know, correcting somebody in your family WhatsApp group if they share something that you know, which we've seen, you know, the people here, like the participants have been saying that they do. I think that's so important. Like, it could be that, it could be not sharing dodgy claims yourself, it could be supporting the journalism that you see, you know, the strong investigative journalism, or just strong reporting that you see that will enable journalists to try and, you know, stop these kind of counterfacts from emerging. So I think for people, it's just about, I think it's really important that we all think about what's our role, like how do we make sure that Ireland does bounce back to being like a low misinformation country, rather than becoming like a lot of other countries and just it becoming kind of part of our discourse and our society.
Yeah, I think me and Christine have talked before about sometimes in Ireland there's a truth pylon. If a politician tries to get away with anything that people are aware aren't true, you kind of just get a complete truth pylon, which I do think fends against some of the stuff we've seen in other countries.
Like Noel Grealish, people might remember that, like last year, Noel Grealish made a claim that was completely outrageous in the Dáil, and on Twitter it was just, it was very heartening to see, but a huge number of people were just correcting him and saying, that's not true, that's not true. And where did you get your facts from? Which I thought was great to see people actually kind of turning it onto somebody and saying, you prove that, you prove what you're saying is true, because you can't.
Right. I'm really aware that there's loads of questions we haven't got to, but we will compile them and we'll look as a fact-checking team to see if there's any way that we can answer them on the journal, or have another forum where we can kind of continue this conversation. I think it's been really healthy, and thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. Just wanted to mention as well that there is a disinformation committee being set up in the European Parliament, and we will be keeping an eye on as to what they're doing, and I'm sure we'll be able to talk to Billy about what information is being talked about there. It's on foreign interference in all democratic processes in the EU, like Christine had said, something that that is a worry across Europe. Nikki is going to show us the answers to our poll results, just to see where we all think the responsibility lies. Our government's doing enough to counter disinformation. A fairly substantial 78% of you says no. And interestingly, who should be the main funder of fact-checking initiatives? And I think there's probably problems with each of these, so which is why it's probably spread out, a mix of the above, 62%, 3% for the public themselves, 1% on media outlets, 19% on social media platforms and search engines, and 15% on governments. It's definitely a good poll there to maybe ask the rest of the country what they think as well. If anyone has any feedback, you have our email address, factcheck@TheJournal.ie. We will have a video of this up if you want to share it with anybody later on this evening, and we'll have an audio version on the Explainer podcast next week. Again, thanks to Nicola, Per, Billy and Christine, and thank you all for using your lunchtime to end our webinar today.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks.
Thank you.